welcome Jim Chalmers up there in sunny Queensland. One day, pandemic the next. Shadow Treasurer of Australia. Thanks for making your time available, my friend. I thought you would like the setting of the Eels poster behind. A good Queenslander like you, just to remind you that at the end of this current NRL season, we did in fact win after 2 rounds. So
well, Broncos are undefeated, of course, as you would know. What you probably don't know is that my old man goes for Parramatta because of that golden period in the early 80s of Kenny and Sterlo and Cronin and Growth and all of those amazing players. So my dad's actually an Eels fan, which I don't tell too many people, but I'm happy to share with you just privately.
Smart fella, and I'm just still living off the major semi-final last year. The Eels just gave you a little reminder of what football could
be. Yeah,
my friend, you're currently sitting there as Shadow Treasurer in the middle of the biggest public health and economic crisis the country's ever seen. You have a unique perspective, having been formerly Chief of Staff to Wayne Swan during the GFC, and you're in the rooms with the bankers and the premiers and others nominating a way out of that crisis. Having had that historical perspective, fairly, how do you rate the way sort of governments are addressing what we're going through so far?
Well, I think they've taken some really welcome steps, Chris, and we've said that publicly throughout. We're trying to be as responsible and supportive and constructive as we can be. For example, we were in the cart for those wage subsidies even before the government was, and when they had a change of heart and came to our view on it, we were very welcoming of that. Clearly, there's some issues that need to be cleaned up in those JobKeeper wage subsidies, but it was a very big step in certainly the right direction to try and maintain a link between employers and their workers through what is a diabolically difficult period. The difference between now and back then, the experience we had 10 or 12 years ago, obviously, is that this is very different because at the same time as the government's got one foot on the brake, it's got another foot on the accelerator. All of these economic challenges are largely a consequence of government decisions, and so to that extent, it's different. In the GFC, we had to accelerate the economy, remarkably successful set of policies that we should be proud of. But now it's a different kind of challenge because at the same time as they're closing down the economy effectively, they're trying to keep parts of it up and running.
I understand the difficulty of being in opposition. Your job is to oppose, to constructively criticise and suggest alternatives at a time when the community's saying, can't we just all come together? It's got to be a tough political balance to pitch that right. So therefore, giving you, say, one free kick, going into this, the economy wasn't real flash anyway, was it? So there's how does that affect our capacity as a nation to respond, to get to the other side of the bridge?
Yeah, I mean, clearly we had some big challenges in the economy, and some of those have been largely forgotten in the big conversation we're having now about what we do. But wages have been stagnant for a really long time. Business investment was going backwards. Productivity had flatlined. Annual growth was below average. Quarterly growth was slowing. We had a whole range of very difficult challenges in the economy. Underemployment was a big part of that as well. And so I do think genuinely that we entered this period from a position of relative weakness rather than strength. That is contested by our political opponents, but I think the facts tell the story there. Where you began that question, I think, is really interesting too, Chris, which is I think people do have in a community higher expectations in crisis times that we try and find common ground, and I think that's understandable. And what we've done, and this is really a credit to Anthony Albanese and the other senior colleagues, is that we've said, look, we'll be as constructive as we can. We haven't held anything up in the Parliament, but constructive doesn't mean being silent. If we think there are gaps in what's being proposed, or if there's not enough urgency getting money into businesses and into the pockets of workers, then we'll say so as well. And I think we have largely struck the right balance. Maybe one day or another we lean too far in one direction or the other. But I think generally we're walking that fine line that you mentioned.
The great sense of unity, Albo wasn't invited into the National Cabinet, but is there other mechanisms you're going through to maintain some sort of involvement in the inner sanctum of governments?
Yeah, look, ideally Anthony would have been in the National Cabinet, but he wasn't. He wasn't begging to be on it. I think it would have been a good idea personally, but they didn't go down that path. There's another opportunity that we have Each week, half a dozen of their senior people, including the PM, meet with Anthony, and half a dozen of the senior people from our side. That has its uses. For example, planning the return of Parliament and how Parliament rolls out. In other areas, it's not quite as useful. Obviously, I can't talk about the conversations themselves, but there is a mechanism, I guess, for us to raise things. I think
in time feel free to give us all. I'm currently getting hay fever from trees behind you, but feel free to splash all the for Western Sydney. We can keep it.
That's right, just between us and your legions of followers, Chris.
It is interesting putting up some other challenges for traditional Labor values on industrial flexibility. Everyone's talking about big reforms coming out of it, about impact on immigration. There's two sort of holy writs for Labor traditionally, maintaining a strong industrial protection and also more open, free borders. Is this going to challenge base Labor values coming out of it for the policy reforms on the other side of the bridge?
I think traditional Labor values will come into it, but I see it more of as a positive. Labor has historically been the party of rebuilding, of recovery, of reconstruction. We've seen that certainly after the Second World War. We've seen that, in difficult times, people can rely on Labor to be the rebuilders of the economy. And so I think that's where our traditional values come into it. Clearly there's going to be a conversation about migration. There will be an appetite for countries, and not just ours, to kind of pull the drawbridge up. And I think we need to have a really balanced conversation about that, recognise the positives of migration. I mean, certainly in Western Sydney, certainly in the southern suburbs of Brisbane, where I'm from, migration's a big part of the story. And so we need to have a balanced conversation about that. Similarly, about industrial relations.
You put the wall up to stop New South Wales men and women coming into Queensland now.
I was asked the other day, Chris, about what I thought about the closing of the New South Wales-Queensland border, and I said it was about 119 years too late. But more seriously, obviously there'll be a conversation about migration, industrial relations as well. I don't think the solution to all this kind of insecure work and precarious work that people have been so troubled by, I don't think the solution is to make the system kind of more precarious and less secure for people. So we'll put those views. But in the broader conversation, I mean, we should be talking, not just about the things that the coalition want us to talk about, business, tax, industrial relations. Those things will be discussed, and we'll engage responsibly in it. But what about energy costs? What about the role of construction in the economy? What about the role of research and development and science? How do we teach our young people to be good at adapting and adopting technology? That's what the growth conversation needs to be about, not just the kind of in the narrow confines that it's been about the last 7 years.
For a Western Sydney audience, we have that spectre of the big infrastructure pipeline to provide confidence and meet the growth. You're from a growth state as well. Will Labor be fully supportive of continuing to roll out the train lines, the airports, the urban amenity improvements and growth? Is that our most obvious way to manage recovery?
Well, I think it's a big part of it, and Anthony Albanese as well as I do, and
he loves the major
building
project
stuff. He loves the major project. The airport, big projects around the country, clearly. So I think it is a big part of it, but again, not the only part of it. It's a good labour-intensive, future-focused, productivity-enhancing game to be involved in, but there are other things that we need to do as well. And I think in that general space, one of the things that really troubles me about the economy of Western Sydney, but also more broadly, is I'm really worried about what's happening to construction, residential construction. The smaller stuff. The master builders have put out some pretty stunning stats about what they expect to happen over the coming months. And so Jason Clare is a proud son of the West, as you know, and Anthony Albanese, boy from Bankstown, and Anthony Albanese, they're making that a big priority too, because I think we need to get all parts of the construction industry supported. The big stuff that you mentioned is one part of it, but also the housing construction sector too.
Jim, you're a Queenslander for your sins as well. The first next electoral manifestation is going to be a Queensland state election on this one. What's your read of how pandemic plays out at the polling booth?
Yeah, it remains to be seen, obviously, but I would have thought people will pay on results, and Anastasia Palaszczuk's done a remarkable job up here, and she's got a good cabinet, and hopefully that's rewarded in October when the best state in the Commonwealth goes to the polls.
They're slugging it out for Virgin. Would you keep Virgin in the air? Is the idea, should government let it go under, then buy it cheap? Should governments be looking at equity stakes rather than bailouts at this stage? Where do you read that one?
Well, I think in this case, the equity stake.
And I assume you support it moving to Badgerys Creek.
Well, on the equity injection in the first instance, I think that makes a lot of sense because you can make it, it's scalable. You can recoup your investment. I think Virgin went to the government something like 9 times and asked for different forms of help and didn't receive it. I think that's disappointing. And one of the reasons why Victorians, the New South Welshmen, and the Queenslanders are now, in this kind of competition for those Virgin jobs is because there's been an absence of national leadership. And I say this not just being a proud Queenslander, but I think it is an unusual time to kind of, with all the uncertainty for these 16,000 workers already, I'm not sure that picking up the HQ and putting it in another part of the country, is necessarily good for those workers. What we need to see is national leadership, and then a government step up and step in and care about, not the 16,000 workers are the most important bit, but also, as we need competitive skies. We need airlines going to some of those regional centres. There are communities around Australia so heavily reliant on tourism that Virgin going under would be a disaster. And so for all of these reasons, yes, I do think the government should have stepped in, probably an equity injection, but if they don't want to go down that path, then some other kind of support.
But just in finishing, you're a young father, you're a politician, patriot, Queenslander, all sorts of things. There's an awful lot of personal transformation happening in this process. For you, post this thing, is it business as unusual? How do you change? How does Jim Chalmers move on following this, or is it still pretty much business as usual if you're inside the political bubble?
No, it's very different, Chris, and it's funny. I was talking to a mutual friend of ours about this the other day. There are so many ways that our lives have changed. The way we work is obviously very different. The last few weeks I've seen more of my kids than for a very long time. That's obviously one of the few bright spots in all of this otherwise diabolical situation. But what I was talking to Andrew Fraser about actually was, it would be weird to get to the end of this period and look back and think, oh, geez, I didn't take full advantage of that time that I had to kind of reset. You notice a lot of people are they're exercising more, they're walking the dog more, they're doing all those sorts of things. And we want to make sure that we don't go back to what we didn't like about how we lived and worked beforehand. We don't want to think that we kind of wasted this reset in our thinking. And when you think about that in a personal sense, in your home life, you kind of think about it in terms of how we go about politics, how we go about economic reform too. It would be really towards empty at our hospitals. That we just go back to everything as it was before. I think that would be, would mean that we haven't learned all the right lessons.
And based on the couple of seconds we just lost you, then we might have put a few bucks into the NBN. It's become obvious to all of us living a life on Zoom. Mate, thank you for your time. For the punters out there who don't know Jim Chalmers, keep an eye on this fella. He's a class act and he's a shadow treasurer in a tough time to be in opposition when government is everything. And I appreciate, I think, all of us, the way in which the opposition has been party to productive outcomes. We've all got a lot of work to do going forward, mate. But last thing, look forward to getting back on the field in Eels Broncos grand final.
That'd be good. It's always nice to talk to you, mate. All the best.
Cheers, buddy. Bye-bye. Thank you.